For parents, in case you need just some space for kids, we do have the 2 rooms through these back doors that are open, and washrooms are as well back there, so feel free to use that. If you want, it's okay, because I have young kids, and it's okay if they scream and make noise. So just relax and give some permission to the midst of that reality that happens. I've been watching... It's funny when you get prepared for a sermon and then you watch something the night before and you're like, oh man, I wish I saw that earlier in the week. So I'm going to add just a slight little story because I think it connects as we begin this morning. I've been watching the series called The Chosen. And it's this online series. It's very well done about the life of Christ. And it walks through some of the gospel stories and gives a perspective maybe we're used to or not used to. I think one of the things my wife and I talked about that I liked about it was it just shows the humanity of the disciples and even Christ. And as they walk through and kind of draws you into the midst of the story. One of the episodes I watched last night was about a gentleman named Nathaniel. And so I put my ears up right away because I have a son named Nathaniel. And I'll always remember the day he found his name in the Bible. That was a pretty exciting day. But Nathaniel's story, they shared his message in this episode very well. He had dreams and he had hopes. We don't know all the backstory, so they filled in a little bit to try to help as he encounters Christ. And what they do is he goes through this moment of where he has high hopes and dreams of something to achieve something, and he loses it. And everything falls apart. And they move to this scene where he's underneath a tree. And in the story, we don't read it in the text, the biblical text, but in the story, in the Chosen video, they talk about he wanted to be an architect. That's the backstory they give him. Was he? I don't know. And he has this drawing. It was in the story, it was his dream they shared to design the synagogue where people could come and worship and hear the word of God. And he had gone to the effort of literally sketching it out on paper. And in this episode, he's sitting under this tree because he's realized that he's never going to have an opportunity under the occupation of Rome to fulfill this dream. And you see him calling out to God. You know those moments of depth when everything's kind of falling apart and you don't know where to turn. And what he does is he pulls out his flint and he lights that paperwork on fire. And it burns up. And he's in this moment of he's lost. And he doesn't know where to go. It's this moment that we've been talking about over the last number of months. We've been reflecting on this topic of grief. And we've been looking at it in different avenues and in different parts of life. We're going to conclude next week with it as we go back to how do we walk alongside those? How do we hold space for those who are experiencing death? Both for the caregivers and those who are losing and the individual who's dying themselves. But this week I want to talk about what do we do when dreams fail. Because for Nathaniel, there was that moment where his dream failed. Now, I don't know, was that real? Did that happen? That was the backstory they gave, but it worked very well because it's at this point where he encounters Christ. What happens is he thinks that God has abandoned him and God has left him. And in the movie, they come to this point where Jesus is like, I saw you under the tree, Nathaniel. And it was in that moment he realized God hadn't abandoned him in the midst of the suffering and the loss that he had experienced. There's a quote that's going to come up on the screen here by Chris Say. He says this: God never promises that our lives won't be filled with storms that devastate our personal finances, our families, and sometimes our hopes and dreams. But ultimately, what the scriptures promise is that Christ will be a redeeming force in the midst of our storms, that He'll always be present with us. Though we're afraid, though we may feel abandoned, God never leaves. If you had a moment in your journey where you were going this way and that door just closed in your life, I want to reflect on the story of Joseph today. The story of Joseph is one of those stories where Joseph's life didn't really go how he thought it would go. It is a roller coaster of a journey. And I think there's some things that we can reflect and we can relate to. The core of Joseph's story is Genesis chapter 37 to 47. There's some parts in the other scriptures, but the core of his story comes in the Old Testament, comes in Genesis 37 to 47. Let me just kind of give big picture today and highlight his story. Maybe there's something there that you can draw in your own life about where you're at. As a boy or teenager, he has this dream, this God-given dream, and he actually doesn't really fully understand it, and probably a little too early in the midst of discovering what that dream might be, he shares it with his brothers. And you understand, you know family dynamics, right? When some of the siblings feel that, well, you're mom and dad's favorite. Right? Like, who was mom and dad's favorite in your family? Like, if you got a brother or sister, you thought about it right away. And if you're not really sure, it's probably you. So just relax, just recognize that and understand how your brother or sister might see you. Right? We say we love everybody, but the truth is, as parents, we probably like a few of our kids a little more than the others, right? We love them, but we connect with different ones. My kids are now trying to figure out who it is in our family. I see you whispering over there. So there's some challenge, let's say, in the midst of the family. By the way, that's one of the great things of the stories, is these are not perfect families. These are families filled with storms and loss of dreams and friction. And as we'll see today, God still has his way of having his hand in their life that eventually leads and guides them and doesn't give up on them. He shares this dream, and he realizes that his brothers don't like the dream, because in the dream it shares that one day his older brothers are going to bow down to him, and they don't like that. The story continues, and the brothers are out in a field taking care of the sheep, and his dad sends him out with some food to go check on the brothers, and he gets out to the field, and the brothers see him coming, and they're like, let's get rid of him. Like, this is how much jealousy has blinded them in the midst of their life, and fear and selfishness. And there's some conversation amongst the brothers what to do and what not to do, and we shouldn't do that, but there's this just towards their brother. And so what eventually they decide to do is they decide to sell him off. You're going to have to read the story because there's a whole bunch in between. I'm going pretty quick here. But they sell him into slavery. And Joseph's life is turned upside down. He's the favored son of his father. Things are going well in the midst of the family, and now everything is turned upside down. It's so bad, the relationships in the family, and the older brothers take and they rip apart his clothes. They put some blood from one of the animals on the clothes, and they lie to their father. And we've been talking about grief over this month. Just imagine that moment and the grief, the stress that brought upon. And the dynamics that as the older siblings watching their father grieve, knowing what they did, and there's lots of questions that I start to ask of how did they feel in the midst of that moment. Eventually, Joseph gets sold into slavery in Egypt. And he gets sold into one of the leaders of the house of Pharaoh, who's one of the powerful men. And he starts kind of working his way up in the midst of the home. And he's doing well, and he's given more responsibility and more power. As a slave, life is going as best it can, and things are good for him. He's starting to settle into the groove. We're not told what his dreams or his ambitions were, but life was, I'm sure it wasn't comfortable, I'm sure it was hard, but he kind of knew what to expect. And then one day, his master's wife kind of comes after him. It's said that Joseph was probably a good-looking young man, and his master's wife saw that, and his master's wife wanted to have sex with him, and he said no. And the reason he said no was in order to honor God and obey God and not disrespect his master and not disrespect her. But she was quite upset because he's the slave and he should do what she wants. And this is what she wants. And so he runs off, and she grabs his cloak and some of his garments and holds onto that and screams. And well, that doesn't go well because he gets accused of something he didn't do, and he's thrown in jail. So just as a recap, he rejected by the brothers, thought things were okay, probably knew they weren't the best, thrown into slavery, things start turning around and going in a good direction, and then thrown into prison. And so in prison, probably not the nicest place to be in the midst of his journey. And he eventually, over time, starts to, once again, God's hand's upon him. He's doing his best to follow God in the midst of it. He raises him up in the midst of the prison, and he's given responsibility over other prisoners and tasks to do. He's overseeing them, and one of the prisoners has this dream. Joseph interprets the dream, and everyone can't believe what happened. And then here's where the story starts to turn again. Something was going on in Pharaoh's house. And one of the guys who was in prison had gotten out of prison and for whatever reason was standing in front of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh had a dream. And he was getting quite angry with everyone in his court because nobody could interpret this dream, and he was getting frustrated. He had a whole bunch of yes men, but nobody would be honest with him. And for whatever reason, one of the men there remembered, hey, there was this guy in prison who interpreted a dream. We should go ask him. And so they go and get Joseph, who's in prison. They bring him up before the Pharaoh. He interprets the dream. Pharaoh agrees with it. It all makes sense. And so gives Joseph some power. And all of a sudden, he's gone from the pit to power in the midst of Pharaoh's kingdom. What a roller coaster in the midst of that. And in this role, he begins to prepare for a famine that was coming, and he helps organize. He's clearly got some good leadership skills and organization skills. He prepares the land for the famine that was going to come, and when the famine came, people from around the area begin to come and ask for help and seek food, and so becomes an economic opportunity for Egypt as well. And one of the families that came to Egypt, it says in Genesis there, was Joseph's brothers. For his father had sent the brothers to go and see if they could get some help from Egypt, some food. Now, when Joseph's brothers stood before Joseph up on the throne with the good robes and all of that, they didn't recognize who he was, but Joseph knew right away who they were. What would you do in that moment? Your family stabbed you in the back, destroyed your dreams, kicked you out, and now you have power to get back. Joseph goes and cries for a little bit. He's filled with incredible emotion. I think most of us would. Either anger, let's destroy them. I probably wouldn't know what to do if I was if I'm him. I think you'd have the joy of being glad to see them and wondering, where is your father? And knowing that they had turned on you. Eventually, what happens, Joseph declares who they are, or who he is. And there's grace that's given. And Joseph says some very important words. Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God has brought good. And it's an incredible story. There's so much in the midst of that story that we can sit on and pull on. But here's what I want us to remember, is that when our dreams fail, when we feel like life is falling apart, your story's not over. We've sung about it today, about a God that redeems. God has this ability to continue to work in the midst of loss in our life. When the psalmists talk about when the ground feels like it's giving away, we don't have to fear. I think it's Psalm 46. But we all know what those moments are like, and the ups and the downs that can come along. What's your moment? Was it a career choice where you started to go down this road and you're not even there anymore? Or maybe it was a business and you put everything you had into it and it didn't work. Maybe you got sick. And one of the things my wife and I have talked about recently, just as we experience loss in the midst of our extended family and friends, is how precious life is and how fast it can change on a dime. Maybe it's a relationship. It's not where you had hoped it would be. There's real grief that's felt in the midst of the loss that exists. And sometimes we don't pause to recognize the reality of it. Joseph, as he went through those ups and downs, there was grief that he experienced. And somehow in the midst of that, like the Psalms that we talked about when we were looking at learning to lament, the Psalms teach us that it's okay to just kind of yell at God and speak about what you're frustrated with and where you're at, but then you turn to the truth. And somehow Joseph was able to do that and able to keep perspective that I don't know how this is going to work out. But somehow God's going to lead and guide us. You know, I've been part of organizations that I've put everything into it, and then it didn't kind of go the direction we had thought. One of the lessons that I'm also learning is that sometimes God will lead you to go in a certain direction. He might even give you a dream in your heart, but it was never going to come about anyways. Because he's more concerned about shaping your character and who you are and growing you in Christ. And your identity is not in the big dream or the things that we'll do or the things that we'll accomplish or the things that we'll have. Our identity is rooted in Christ. And so when dreams fail, our story's not over. There's still hope. There's still redemption. Today I want to just give us a couple of things of what to do when we experience grief from the loss of dreams in the midst of our life. So here's the first one. And this one is definitely coming out of like personal experience. Is check your view of what success or failure is. Because so often we put success up here. Bigger things, lots of fireworks, lots of money, we're well known. You know, I've done enough funerals. I've met enough people who are in the moments of near the end of life. Those are never the things they celebrate. Man, you would not believe how much money I made over my lifetime. It's not what they're celebrating or grieving. What's really important? I think COVID has actually allowed a moment in time, and I don't want us to miss that moment, to ask the question, what do I want out of life? What does it look like for me to follow and obey Christ in the midst of this season? And for some of us, we need to redefine expectations and failures, because I'll touch on the failures one. Some of us have entered experiences where we've lost a dream and we would say that was a failure. But here's the truth. Maybe it was a failure in the midst of the world's eyes. It didn't happen. But there are things that you learned. There are ways that God shaped you. There are influences that you had upon individuals that will impact them for good for the rest of their life. So that becomes a real challenge when we start to look at failures in our life, because it can become a growth experience. And where is God leading us now? Here's number 2, which is connected, is to check your expectations. Expectations. You know, some of us have unrealistic expectations about ourselves. Like, think about this. How many have watched American Idol or some version of that show, right? There's all these different kind of singing shows. Like, how many of those people were up on that stage? Like, you feel bad for them because you know the show is setting them up to fail. And they are convinced that they can sing. And nobody in their life had the ability to love them enough to say, you are a horrible singer, but keep doing it, just you're never going to be a singer. And they stand before those judges and get literally humiliated in front of the nation. Sometimes expectations, we just have wrong expectations about us, and we're not willing to admit the good limitations we have. Often we think limitations are a bad thing, but there can be a strength in the midst of that. Sometimes we have wrong expectations of our family members, our spouse, or our kids, and that gets us into trouble. Sometimes we have wrong expectations of, we just came through I guess there was no government change, but we came through an election. How many wrong expectations do we have of these leaders? We need to be praying for our leaders, by the way. or our neighbors. Expectations in the midst of dreams and the loss of dreams can take us down a negative road if we're not careful. Number 3, fits very much in with what we're talking about, is give time to grieve. I remember when something changed in the midst of my family's life that we really didn't plan. We were putting everything into it, all that we had, and then came to the realization this is not going to work. And I remember sitting down with someone and them kind of calling me out and saying, you need to grieve. This is a real loss that you are experiencing in the midst of your life. You know, they challenged me on what success and failure looked like. They challenged me because they said, if you succeeded, you'd have no issues in giving God the glory. So why would you not give God the glory now? Because clearly there was good things even though it didn't turn out how you hoped. And so you got to name it and understand it. We see that in the midst of the Psalms. Calling out for things that they want that haven't come. And I want to say, if you're in the midst of that loss, give time for grief. It's okay. On the way to church this morning, one of the songs that came on on the hard drive in the van. There's just songs we put on there a long time ago, and one of the songs that came up said, "Breathe. It's okay. Just breathe." And I think we need to do that. Just as Tony led us in prayer, we open our hands up and we just take a deep breath and we say, God, here's how I'm feeling. And even if it's nasty words we don't want anyone to know that we say, we just be completely honest with where we're at in life. And we invite him in the midst of those moments to come and to lead us to what is true and to remind us of the truths that we have. So give time to grieve. You may have fallen off the bike, but there's a new bike that you're going to get to learn again, which is our 4th point, is to dream again. I don't know how long grief, the process is going to take for you. I can't say after 7 days you're good to go. Get going. It's different for all of us. And some of the grief, we've talked about this in the midst of loss. Some grief never leaves us. We just learn to walk with it in the strength of Christ. And it's there. Some of us need to dream again. And this comes back to the core of who we are and who Christ has called us to be. And just because the dream didn't work out how we thought it would or other people thought it would, it doesn't mean that we give up in life. There are still people who need our influence. There are still people who need our help. There are skills and experiences that the world needs. And if we're willing to step out, God will open doors for us to be a blessing to those around us. And so maybe you fell off the bike. Maybe it's not an option to get back on the bike you want to be on. But what if there's another bike? God's like, come this way. Try this one out. And you got to get the training wheels back out and put those training wheels on the bike again and relearn how to run it or ride it, sorry. Maybe you crash into a few bushes along the way. That's okay. But learn to dream again. Life isn't over. Number 5 is celebrate. The story of Joseph reminds us of the power of stories. That's why the scriptures are full of these stories of real people's lives, of how they journeyed through the ups and the downs of life, and somehow God's hand guided them through the midst of the goodness and the failures that existed. And so let us celebrate what God has done and who God is and what we have experienced and how it has shaped us. Not all dreams are going to go how we think they will go. And sometimes I wonder if God just gives us a dream to kind of push us in a certain direction. But it's not where we're going to end up. I think of Abraham who God's like, hey, I want you to start walking. Where should I go, God? You see those 3 mountains? Just start heading that way. Well, where are we going, God? Just walk that way. And we don't know the answer. But we'll discover that in the midst of the journey. And it might change and take different directions. But we have hope. One of the books that I'm reading right now is, just find the title, is called Hanging On and Let Go. What to Do When Your Dreams Are Shattered and Life is Falling Apart. It's by a gentleman named Frank Viola. And I have a quote that's going to come up on the screen. And near the end of one of the chapters, he writes this, and I think it's appropriate for us as we talk about the loss of dreams. And here's the deal, is you're going to come alongside somebody who's going to feel this loss of a dream in the midst of their life. We will have the incredible opportunity to bring hope and peace and journey with somebody as they go through maybe the low parts of life. And so he's speaking out of his own experience of what somebody shared to him. So let me read it. If you're going through the fire right now, let me pass on a word of encouragement. It's something one of my friends told me near the end of my dark night when my hope was fading, and I'm going to pay it forward. God, listen to this. This is you. God is creating a masterpiece. You are in a delicate but wondrous place. Giving up is not an option. You are closer now than you have ever been. And so rest and recharge. God is at work. Desperation is part of transformation. And so don't give the enemy a foothold in the midst of your frustration. We sing about a God that redeems us, that went to the grave and ripped us out of the grave to give us life through the resurrection. We have hope in the midst of the storm. We're going to sing about it, I'm pretty sure, in a moment. Living hope. They're giving me the yes, so I remembered well. That's good. But this is something to celebrate. That God is with us, and He's never left us. And He's going to keep moving with us. Grief from loss of a dream is real. But as someone shared with me recently, trust God. God is at work, and God will lead. Trust God. God is at work, and God will lead.